Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you all on behalf of SETA Foundation to this important event, criminalization of Muslim political activism in Europe. As you know, recently we have witnessed a series of decisions by different European states which targeted Muslim civil society and NGOs in France, but also in Austria and other European countries. And this is becoming increasingly a systematic targeting of Muslim activism in Europe. And in the past, it was more, there was a talk about radicalization and also war on terror narrative. But today it has shifted to a fight against political Islam, etc. So today we are going to discuss this transformation also. And we have three distinguished speakers with us. One, Yasser Louati from France, Hatem Bazian from San Francisco, and Salman Sayyid from University of Leeds. They are especially three scholars working on this subject in Europe, but also in the United States. And today we are going to discuss this issue. And I would like to start with Yasser. Yasser, you are based in France, and you've been following this issue quite closely. And you have also contributed to our report on European Islamophobia, especially you written the country report on France. I mean, there was always this problem with racism in France, and the minorities had difficulties. However, I think, I mean, it was institutional racism, but I think we have reached a new phase, a new era in this discrimination. Do you think also so? And why do you think this is happening now? I mean, and with this question, I would like to give the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Enes, and thanks to SETA for hosting this event again on France, the famous laboratory of Islamophobia, and for giving an international platform to these struggles being faced by minorities throughout Europe, and in my case, in France. Now, as you said earlier in the introduction, that things are indeed accelerating in France, especially since Emmanuel Macron's discourse held at the western city of Les Mureaux in early October 2020. And that one was on his newfound struggle against the so-called Islamist separatism. Now, of course, this term separatism did not come out of nowhere. Each administration had its own brand of labeling Muslims as a domestic problem, threat, etc., etc. It was communitarism before, which means Muslims living in their communities and refusing to join the national body, which is not true, especially when you know that Muslims are 5 times more likely of facing job discrimination, that if you are a Muslim woman wearing a headscarf in France, you stand a 1% chance of getting a job, that if you are a black or Arab youngster in France, you are 20 times more likely of facing police brutality and potentially police death at the hands of the police, while Muslims keep shouting over and over that they want to be treated as fully fledged citizens. Now, of course, after this communitarism, we have this new brand of, anti-Muslim labeling, separatism, which actually came about right after the Black Lives Matter marches in June of 2020, in reaction to the thousands of people who took to the street to call out systemic racism in France, which has been documented for decades, even from within the government's institutions, to call out police brutality, which is itself called out by various reports by the national consultative body called the CNCDH in France, racial profiling by the police, etc. And the reaction of the government was not to at least listen to what was being said. It reacted in principle that if these blacks and Arabs from the banlieue and their white allies dare to march on these topics, they are separatists when it comes to blacks and Arabs, and if they are white, they are Islamo-gauchists or Islamo-leftists. And that's the how Emmanuel Macron not only oversimplified, the issue, but literally adopted a dangerously ideological and simplistic view of French society. And this separatism today is being used as the rallying cry against Muslims today to literally criminalize their capacity to organize and to be subdued and put into a chokehold, and for them to submit and accept what can be said, what can be done, what kind of Muslims they can be and cannot be according to the executive branch of power. And this is not a precedent, it's only an acceleration of history. Now, of course, we can say that because Emmanuel Macron is preparing his re-election in the next 16 months, 15 soon by the end of this month, people would, of course, would make the connection and say he's doing, what candidates do, which means scapegoat minorities in order for him to ape the far right and, defeat them in their own, playing field. The problem is that it's much deeper than that. The fact that the president is chasing the far right in its own ideas, using their rhetoric and their definition of what French society should be, is an indication that because it was done, by Emmanuel Macron, by François Hollande, Nicolas Sarkozy, even to some extent Jacques Chirac before that, it's an indication that the ideas of the far right have become so mainstream that only a conservative or hard right revolution made this possible, which means ideas which were on the fringe or on the margins of the mainstream political spectrum in France have literally become mainstream today, to the point of being the point of convergence for candidates running for election. And what Emmanuel Macron today is doing is, yes, a tactical move, but it is also an indication of a much deeper problem, which is the rehabilitation of the ancestral far right in France today. Now, if we want to take a look at the policies that were proposed by Emmanuel Macron back in October, we heard him speak of the capacity or the allowing the French state to violate laïcité in the name of fighting so-called Islamist separatism. That means Emmanuel Macron, while accusing Muslims of not respecting and abiding by laïcité, is himself seeking the right to violate laïcité and hence the French constitution in order to specifically target Muslims. How? For example, he asks for the state to be able to intervene in Muslim organizations, to decide who can be a board member, to decide who can be an imam, who cannot be, and of course to outsource the management of Muslim affairs to the CFCM, just like we had the Qaid or the Qaid in the colonies back in Africa. Today we have the CFCM, which is the French Council of the Muslim Faith, that is today acting as the transmission belt between the orders given by the French government and the French Muslim communities. And to better define what the CFCM is doing, it is not as it pretends to be a representative of Muslims before the state. It is a representative of Muslims, of the state, before Muslims, and actually to transmit the orders given by the French government towards Muslims. The other idea was to make it almost impossible for Muslim families to adopt homeschooling. And this is, of course, in the name of saving Muslim children. Now, if this government and the others before them did care about Muslim children going to the French Republic's public schools, they wouldn't have passed an anti-Muslim law that in and of itself violates laïcité in 2004, which bans the wearing of the Muslim headscarf. In reality, what would happen? Many say, well, Muslim girls, if they don't want to go to public schools, they can go to private schools. Yeah, but if she cannot go to a public school and cannot afford to go to a private school, what is the last remaining option? Of course, it would be homeschooling. The curricula is well known by everybody. It is published on the internet, and we have the national CNED, the national whatever organization that provides students with distance learning and to follow the regular curricula. Even that, Emmanuel Macron wants to make it impossible specifically for Muslims and in not any other community. Now, I was interviewed by Al Jazeera right after Emmanuel Macron spoke to them on the Arabic outlet, and I was on the English one. And of course, he went on crying and whining about how he has been misunderstood, misquoted, etc., and that these laws do not target Muslims, which is a blatant lie. This law is specifically targeting Muslims because his Minister of Interior, Gérald Darmanin, when he went to visit the Grand Mosque of Paris, he told members of the infamous, again, CFCM, the French Council of the Muslim Faith, he told them, we do not want other communities to feel targeted by the adjustments we are making specifically for you. Plain simple, right? Now, just a few days ago, we had some information being leaked on the initiatives taken by the government. And when I say they are attempting to criminalize even the mere fact that Muslims can organize as a community, it is not a slogan or something we say as a catchphrase. Emmanuel Macron wants to be the person who decides what is a good Muslim and what is not a good Muslim. And for that, he got the legitimacy of this so-called CFCM. And this CFCM, to please Emmanuel Macron, rather than telling him, this is a secular country, it is not on the president to intervene in clerical affairs to decide what is a good Islam and a bad Islam, what kind of practice Muslims can adopt. They went on and continued with him and proposed to him a National Council of Imams. So here we have the CFCM that was set up by Nicolas Sarkozy, the former Minister of Interior, turned president. In 2003, in complete violation of laicity, an organization that never held free, fair, and transparent elections, never elected Muslims from the grassroots, itself being composed of federations that only represent the interests of foreign countries. On top of it, it never elected any women at its board, let alone at its head, never welcomed Muslims in their diverse composition. That organization has come up with the idea to set up a National Council of Imams, and this National Council of Imams has come up with a charter called, listen to me carefully, gentlemen, and because this is extremely serious. The charter is called the Charter of Princip, the Charter of French Muslims Principles, or the Principles of French Muslims Charter. So it's not a charter by the CFCM for its own imams throughout France. It has been written in the name of all Muslims and just proposed to Emmanuel Macron and Gérald Darmanin. And this charter begins with a rather laughable introduction. Let me give you a quick translation. We, responsible individuals of organizations, federations, imams, aumônier, I forgot, the person who does a charity in jails, etc. I forgot the name. Managers of places of worship, we solely commit to this charter as French citizens and as members of civil society who happen to be Muslims, to abide by the rules set up by this Charter of Principles. And this charter has been written to give a framework of ethics, codes of conduct, and deontology for those who are acting as imams. And to make things worse, Not only is the charter being proposed by the government, the head of the CFCM, Mohammed Moussaoui, who I mean, I'm sorry, I have to say it. When you have individuals who come from abroad, who are raised in a specific political system, who do not understand how democracy functions, how the separation of church and state functions, they cannot be expected to understand it here in France. So Mohammed Moussaoui, who was raised on a Moroccan software, which may be good for Moroccans in Morocco, but that is completely unfit here in a secular republic called France, Mohammed Moussaoui, after having called out the boycott of France by Muslims around the world for its publishing of the cartoons in the name of protecting the national interest, don't even get me started on that, Mohammed Moussaoui declares, this charter of values was asked by the French president and is not only for imams who will be member of the upcoming National Council of the Imams. It will also be used for the rest of imams across the country, which means even if a mosque decides not to sign, that charter will be applicable according to the government and would be used against various mosques. Now, to continue on this line, we have here a series of revelations that show that people do not agree necessarily with this charter, but people are so terrified of going against it because they know, and even Emmanuel Macron said it outside of a meeting, that we will see who signs this charter because we know it is radical. We will see who signs this charter and who doesn't, and we will come to the proper conclusions. Now, having said that, this is only for the side of how affairs will be managed in mosques. But now to conclude, we are facing a long-term problem, is that the dissolution of CCIF and Bayraklı City, regardless of what can be said on the way they dealt with how the government came after them. I don't think it was right for them to self-dissolve and just leave. People complained about it. The government had no legal grounds whatsoever to shut down CCIF or Bayraklı City. It was a political decision. It could have been challenged in court, and they could have dragged the story long enough for the next president to come and say, enough is enough, let's put an end to this. This is becoming a long-term embarrassment. But anyways, we have now the criminalization of any Muslim organization that does not adopt the dogma being imposed by the French government. And on top of it, we heard that the Grand Mosque of Paris has been the power broker that allowed this charter to emerge, but also pushing for more stringent control over Islam in France. So the Grand Mosque of Paris would be itself promoted by the government as the go-to organization to, how can I say, manage Muslim affairs. But this is not the end of it. We have seen the shutting down of private Muslim schools. Historically speaking, for the past 15 years, Muslim private schools have been under tremendous financial difficulties. And Emmanuel Macron, in his speech in Les Mureaux of early October, he said, we will apply extreme administrative and financial pressure on those schools to make them abide by our set of rules. And the only private Muslim schools in Paris has been shut down last week. And what we still see Muslim communities in shock and awe because they do not know how to react. Now, to finish, and I know I've been talking for long enough, we will not see a change or any reversal of course of action by this government. This will not happen. But on top of it, what we see is that this is only made possible because the bogus organizations set up by the French state for the past 15 years have not been criticized and challenged by Muslim communities themselves. And many Muslims, unfortunately, thought that by just, ignoring those organizations, the problem would go away. Emmanuel Macron knows the French Council of the Muslim Faith is completely illegitimate. They know this organization does not represent Muslims, yet it is a handy stick they can use to beat down on French Muslims. And what we see today is that the law to protect or to promote French values is only the latest example of how far-right ideas have come to power. Tomorrow things will get worse. We have already seen the criminalization of support to Palestine, the criminalization of the BDS movement. But the good news is that the European Court of Human Rights has deemed illegal France's banning of the prosecution of BDS activists. Now, the last point of this presentation, if I may, is that everything that's happening today is not happening out of nowhere. It is deeply rooted in a 40-year long effort to bring the far right from the mainstream. And that is why Marine Le Pen has become an acceptable candidate. She no longer, questions the EU and the Eurozone, etc. But on top of it, Emmanuel Macron thinks that by aping the far right, he may win. What we think would happen is he may get re-elected, but he also warned us last week by saying to a social media platform, I may have to take extremely unpopular decisions, and those highly unpopular decisions would make it impossible for me to run again. Now, this could mean the worst or the best are yet to come, and this only depends on how Muslims value their human rights and civil liberties and how hard they are willing to fight for them. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Yasser, for this extensive analysis of the current situation there in France. I would like to now move to Hatem. Hatem, as Yasser pictured a very bleak picture, in France, but as I mentioned in the beginning, there was this narrative on fight on terror, and it was quite useful for Western actors to justify their policies in the Muslim world. But then, why do you think it's not enough now? This concept, and now there is this discussion on, the Muslim Brotherhood and political Islam, and then all this. New, I think. There was this question before as well, but now we see that the head of states are using this language, especially in Austria. There is this talk of that the Austrian government wants to now criminalize political Islam, whatever it may be. So why do you think this shift has happened recently in Europe? And I'm not quite sure about the discussion in the United States, but maybe you can also add your comments on that as well.
Thank you, Enes, for the invitation, and for SETA for hosting this conversation. And also thanks for Yasser for giving us the really broad strokes of what is underway in France, being also representative of a broader assault on Muslims as a class or as a global category. In here, we might find differences in the manifestation of the targeting of the Muslim subject, or those who might be mistaken or even allies of Muslims. We have different manifestations in different parts of the world, whether in France, Austria, UK, Netherlands, Sweden, Poland, or the United States. The markers of targeting shifts depending on state priorities or state actors based on constructing their own interest and analysis. But this has to be fitted in within a broader understanding of Muslims as citizens, both in the global north, in Europe, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, but also Muslims as, if we could put citizens between parentheses, in the global south or in Muslim majority countries, because the concept of citizenship, in essence, in some places doesn't really have any real meaning, considering that you're subject to the despotic authoritarianism that manifests itself, or the dynasties and monarchies. What we are witnessing is this shifting of markers from the war on terrorism to political Islam, to jihadism, to Sharia. All these are, in essence, for me, are the marketing tools. Just like when you have the new and improved flavor of a shampoo or a drink or a car, you pick new aspects to highlight and push the policy or push the advertisement strategy. But it all comes from the same conceptualization that the Muslim in the current Islamophobic Orientalist social imaginary is a category or as a subject that does not belong. So we're speaking about secularism, which in essence is separation of church, mosque, synagogue, temple, and the state. But when we are speaking in relations to Muslims, secularism means for the state and the secular actors to be structurally anti-Muslim as a way to express their secularism. So a Muslim who wants to exercise their political rights as a citizen is confronted that they have to meet the constructed test, which means that they have to prove that they don't have much Islam left in them. So you have to have a most likely developed, just as we're right now having the COVID-19 vaccine, most likely those who are prescribing to this type of secularism want to develop maybe a vaccine or a DNA test to see whether Muslims have any type of traces left in them relative to Islam. That is not the same relative to other communities and groups. And in essence, you could see this if we speak about the Uyghurs in China. You could even almost speak about it in biological terms, biological racism terms. So citizenship as a political activity for Muslims, you can't even enter into the domain of actually exercising, being in a secular state and exercising your Muslimness in this sense. Now, in Muslim majority countries that have also developed a particular antagonistic definition of secularism, you actually see the same type of articulations, or even those who prescribe to saying that they're the custodians of Islam. For them, there is a particular type of a definition of Islam. It's basically the huggable, tickable, and apolitical Muslim who basically is happy just to be there, cuddly type of personality that does not express any type of opinion on anything of meaning. And you ask them what to do, and they offer you an already prescribed analysis. So political activity as relations to citizenship is not there for Muslims. Yes, they have the citizenship, which is the piece of paper, but that piece of paper is not equal. In the same way in the United States that black individuals were citizens, but they were unequal, and they continue to be unequal in this sense. So Muslims in France, Muslims in Austria, Muslims in the UK, and in other places, yes, they have the papers of citizenship, but that citizenship is of not equal, because you have to prove that you don't have Islam in you. So that's, in essence, formal rights, formal papers does not translate to actually full political activity and representation in this. Furthermore, also citizenship as it relates to rights, and here I'm using Larry Volp's work and others in relations to this notion of citizenship. that we don't enjoy the same rights. We're subject to hyper surveillance. And I know many of you are aware that just recently we found out that the Muslim prayer app, Muslim Pro, as well as another app, a dating app, Muslim dating app, the data from those apps were collected by the Pentagon. And I would say that this is the tip of the iceberg. If I would actually put my statement and hypothesis, I would say every type of technology that Muslims are using have commodified the data about them and sold to security agencies. Now we know that at least in relations to the Khashoggi case with Saudi Arabia, that his data was hacked and gotten to, as well as his Facebook, as well as some of the Saudi dissidents' Facebook information was actually arrived to. So the notion of the right to privacy, the freedom of association that we often identify in democratic societies is not there. The free speech, again, yes, you have free speech if you're just speaking to yourself in the mirror, but free speech as relates to Muslims, that you only are allowed to say one thing: I condemn terrorism. And that's as far as the free speech that you have. So in essence, you really don't have the right to free speech. And for those who are observing the French contradictions as well as other Europeans' contradictions relative to the BDS, the boycott, divestment, and sanction, why they're celebrated and they insist on Charlie Hebdo's and the French political and social cultural elite to insult Muslims, to promote the despicable cartoons, which I don't think of it as free speech. I think of it as a structural taunting of Muslims. And there's nothing funny about taunting and bullying a minority, marginalized groups in society. If you satire at its core is to actually poke fun at the powerful, at those who have the means of power, that those who actually are able and continue to shape society. So for those who are hiding behind free speech and freedom of expression, in a very short period of time, on the one side, they put the hat of free speech and freedom of expression, like Macron and others. On the other, they put the silencing of Arabs, Muslims, Palestinians, and advocates of Palestine by saying that you cannot actually advocate and speak on the PDS, and you're subject to prosecution at this point. And you could see right now in the UK, and I think Salman possibly will touch, but I'm not saying that this is the case, the whole attack on Corbyn, Jeremy Corbyn, and the whole attack on so-called anti-Semitism within the labor movement, which is something that has been stoked and put into at least into process by segments of the pro-Israel civil society in the UK, in collaboration with Israel itself, a foreign country intervening. But that is considered to be free speech and freedom of associations and so on. So those are restricted to Muslims, and they don't have these rights to be enjoyed upon. More importantly, as Yasser mentioned, these structured boards that are created by the state knows this whole notion of freedom of religion, which is supposedly is one of the aspects that are often celebrated both in the United States and parts of Europe as it relates to separation of church and state. What we see in here is that the secular state is actually becoming the mufti. So essentially, we need to speak about Macron becoming the mufti of France, giving us fatwa about what is and what is not Islam, and really feeling at ease in actually trying to define the scope of what religion is. So Muslims in current context do not enjoy these basic freedoms that are constitutive of citizenship in general. And then the whole notion of citizenship as a form of identity as you know, this whole notion that you cannot be French to the source, because Frenchness is attributed in relations to the right wing, but also Macron is not counted to be the right wing. In essence, the broader spectrum of society is attributed to being white. So Frenchness and whiteness are being commensurate to one another in the social imaginary that is in functioning, in the same way that the United States is the question that you're often asked, are you American? Which means it's basically saying you don't look white, then therefore your citizenship, your identity as a form of citizenship is not there. You are not broadly understood to be part of this mixture. The fifth item that I want to really try to sum up so we could have listen to Salman and have a question, is this notion that if we think about the society as far as constructing your own contribution epistemologically to the society, Western society is defined as Judeo-Christian. And every once in a while, as somebody wants to be celebrated that they're into the mix of diversity, they will throw Islam or Muslims in there as a nod. But make no mistake about it, that we are speaking about within epistemological structure, it's a Judeo-Christian, and even the Judeo is just about 50 to 60 years been added into the discussion in terms of Judeo-Christian. So Muslims as co-contributors to the epistemological structure of their society, you actually are not accorded the same type of rights within the whole scope of citizenship. So for example, you have the whole notions of creeping Sharia. You have the notions of French values that are really emerging out of Judeo-Christian understanding. So Muslim values do not have the same equal standing. Speaking of Muslim charities, zakat, Islamic law, and so on, this is contested because you're not seen as belonging. You are basically a Martian that happens to live in France, US, UK, and so on. Therefore, you don't have the same ability or the same rights accorded relative to your citizenship. While on the other, a person who's, in essence, even doesn't believe anything, as long as they don't come from the Islamic, what you call sequestered and targeted and completely otherized groups, you could actually still almost put nonsense in circulations, and you are celebrated as, well, he had a point, his opinion is valid. I know it's complete nonsense, but he has a valid point of view in relation to others. But as a Muslim, as soon as you express, again, that your ability to contribute from your own epistemological vantage point, now they don't call people to actually see and engage with you, they call the security services. So you're subject, even in the epistemological structure, you're subject to this hyper surveillance and hyper examination in this sense. So again, what we need is really to challenge the whole notion of what is citizenship in this current term. What does it mean for secularism, and what does it mean for the state actually having an antagonistic definition of citizenship relative to Muslims? The last point I want to say, that it is not surprising to me that European states are also in constructing relationship with Muslim majority countries that also have an antagonistic project toward Islam and Muslimness. In essence, if you just think about the French state celebrating Sisi and vetting him with a high award of importance, this is a person that killed 2,000 individuals in one day. Which means that basically he's been admitted to this club of colonialism, post-colonialism. In essence, you qualify into membership. So there is this, what you call, both dialectic but also circular relationship between the global north and Muslim majority states that are defining and creating a scope of what is acceptable Islam and what is not acceptable Islam. And this is coming in a post-colonial structure that sees that the European states and the United States embrace despotic authoritarian regimes as a way of maintaining military-industrial complex, post-colonial economic interest, neoliberalism. And therefore, it's not surprising to see that they're amplifying and reaffirming their own worldview vis-a-vis the society. So if the French really are interested in stopping violence, I would actually recommend for them to first stop selling weapons of mass destruction to those who are actually engaged in mass killing, whether it's in relations to Yemen or in relations to Libya or other places, or also stop intervening in many of their ex-colonies, the Francophone areas, where France still has almost 47 different places of military presence in the global south. So they give us all these what you call high moral, ethical values, and then they go as business as usual, which is selling, manufacturing, and marketing death machines as part of the structure of the states. Thank you.
Hatem, for this wonderful introduction, maybe, and if you have questions, we will discuss further. But now I would like to move to Salman, and thank you very much, Salman, for joining us today, this evening, and in the European continent, and maybe today.
Further away.
Yes. But I would like to ask you the same question, because you wrote extensively on the Islamism issue, especially in the 90s, your book on fear of Islam, fear of fundamentalism, fundamental fear, sorry. But there is this recent emphasis on political Islam. So why do you think there is, that this recent, let's say, flare up of this discussion? I mean, because we haven't been discussing this issue. I mean, I remember in the 90s in Turkey also, there was this discussion about Islamist, fundamentalists, they are on the rise, and etc., etc. But suddenly it has disappeared from the discussion, and we had this war on terror, and then suddenly we are back. I mean, why do you think there's this discussion now today? Thank you.
Thank you, Enes, and thank you, SETA, for organizing this very timely and important conference. I think it's a really important question. If you look at the relationship around the discussions on political Islam and its various iterations, it goes through ebbs and flows. So at certain points, for example, just after the Islamic Revolution in Iran, there was a huge emphasis on what they used to call Islamic fundamentalism, Islamism, etc. And then every couple of years later, then they say, well, it's all finished now, it's all died out. And then something else comes up, like, for example, the war on terror. There's an emphasis on political Islam, and then that dies out. And part of the reason is this: there's a fundamental misunderstanding about what Islamism is and how it persists. I think one of the issues with the way that the dominant narratives around Islamism is and Muslims remains locked into the logic of colonialism and Eurocentrism. And the language of colonialism means that those who are colonial subjects, those who are colonized, those who are not modern, those who are primitive, can never be history makers, and they can never be political. So in that sense, what things that happen to them either have a cyclical quality or an instinctive quality, that they do what they're always doing and they do what is in their culture. There is no political theory, there's no political development in their thinking. As a result, Islamism and various iterations of political Islam appear not as responses to particular conditions of the Muslim Ummah at particular times, but rather as something which has always been part of Islamic culture, of Islam, since the beginning. And therefore, there's nothing really to explain. The idea of a Muslim fanatic is quite consistent. It also contrasts with the idea of the Muslim fatalist, the Muslim who is unable to respond to any reality, to any stimuluses. So caught between being not just good Muslims and bad Muslims, but Muslims who are overactive to Muslims who are over inactive. That is the kind of spaces that you have for performing Muslimness. So as a consequence, any kind of expression of the kind of hope or aspirations for Muslim autonomy are always considered to be somehow incredibly problematic and are never given their real historical understanding. So in many ways, what we could argue is this, that the so-called problems of political Islam are really not problems with the culture, the religion. They're specific responses to a political situation in which now you have a perhaps between 25% to 20% of the world's population, which is described as being Muslim. Many of them describe themselves as being Muslim, but they have no overarching global political structure to seriously represent themselves. They cannot represent themselves. And in this gap between a kind of a political community which exists and this inability to represent itself, to make itself felt, you have the tragedy, not just of Muslimness, but I would say of the world right now. To give you, I could give you many, many examples, but let's take, for example, the what's happened to the Rohingya. There was no, what happened to the Rohingya, what has happened, there's no ability for the Muslim community, and not just the Muslim governments I'm talking about, the Muslim people themselves, to actually make their solidarity with the Rohingya felt, to make a kind of a response to that. What happened to the Uyghurs? What's happening to Muslims in India? What's been happening to Muslims in, in many, many parts of the world, in Bosnia, the Palestinian? And we could sit here and name all these places where Muslimness has become the object of immense systematic cruelty. And then we would say, well, what can you do about it? What can be done about it? And you find that there is no structure, no possibility of doing anything about it for Muslims. The Muslims do not have a voice or ability to affect the world through some organized means of being able to say, look, you need to do something, or look, Burma, you need to stop doing this. So that means there's a total disregard of Muslim expressions of solidarity, kinship, but not just Muslim, but other people of good faith who may want to express solidarity, who think that genocide is just is wrong, or what's happening to the Uyghurs is wrong, what's happening to the Palestinians is wrong. So I think there is that structural problem in which the quest for Muslim autonomy has not been able to ground itself in global structures which give voice to the voices for Muslim autonomy. So that's the first point that I would like to make. The second point is related, and I think both Yasser and Hatem have actually touched upon this. One of the issues we face is that the world right now is becoming increasingly organized by the grammar of Islamophobia. That Islamophobia is not just something which happens to you, to someone who's perceived to be a Muslimness expressed by hijab, beard, clothing, whatever that may be, in a bus or a public transport, but it is actually the grammar of world governance. If you listen to the reports or the excuses that the administrators of genocide in Burma or the administrators of the concentration camps in among the Uyghurs, or the those responsible for introducing a kind of a Islamophobic Jim Crow in India, for the apartheid in occupied Palestine, all of those groupings, all of those people, just to use an example, and I would add now Macron and what's happening in Austria, what's happening in the United States, seem to use a very, very similar vocabulary. In fact, we could probably sit here and write out communiques on their behalf, which would say, we have to carry out these policies because Muslims are being radicalized. They're radicalized because of influence from their religion, or influence from their imams, or because there is something wrong with Islam, it is in crisis, and therefore to prevent radicalization, because radicalization will lead to terrorism, and terrorism will mean that other people are harmed, we have to take these measures to modernize Islam, to nationalize Islam, to make Islam more Chinese, more Burmese, more Indian, more French, more Austrian, to make it more everything except what it wants to be, more itself. So that phenomenon exists right now. There is a global institution of Islamophobia. What there isn't is a global institution of anti-Islamophobia. There is no countervailing force or structure which challenges Islamophobia systematically, fearlessly, relentlessly across the globe. As a consequence, what happens is this, and as the title of the this gathering makes clear, is that Muslim voices in various spaces are isolated, they are subjugated to vilification, to threats, and of course, then they are also criminalized. And you have this whole panoply of trying to prevent the Muslim voices for speaking for themselves. And that, in a sense, means that the Islamophobic narrative, which has all the resources of many, many countries, many large organizations, and ability to coordinate itself, is constantly running against Muslims who are completely unaware often, or they're unaware in the sense that their biographies, they may experience some Islamophobia, but they do not have the means systematically to connect them up. So that, I think, is this inability of the forces of Islam, anti-Islamophobia, to actually form together, to coordinate themselves, is a major, major problem. Because in the end, if that is not checked, what Islamophobia is about is not the fear of Muslims, as many say, or the hatred of Muslims. Islamophobia wants to imagine another world in which there is no Muslimness which is independent, that Muslimness is completely subjugated, if it exists at all, that it loses its ability to voice alternative, to speak not only truth to power, but speak at all. So the final point that I would want to come up with this is this, that to recognize these commonalities and the necessity of anti-Islamophobia being important, not just to preserve Muslim well-being, which I think is important enough, but ultimately anti-Islamophobia is necessary to preserve the plurality of the planet and the hope for a future which is different than the homogenization, the tyranny, the kind of attempt of surveillance to integrate and devoid all humans, not just Muslims, of the ability to write their own histories as part of their biography. So I think it's really, really important that we recognize the scale of what Islamophobia is doing. It is on the back of Muslims and on the back of actually many Muslim women reshaping the relationship between the rulers and the ruled, reshaping what it means to be a citizen, what it means to be even human, what it means to have rights. And they're doing this by arguing that only through the repression of Muslim voices will you be safe. And what I would contend, the repression of Muslim voices means the repression of any kind of alternative, and ultimately means lack of safety for everybody else. So I think the point's already been made that Muslims can be Islamophobes. Some of the most prominent Muslim organizations and states are involved in actively promoting Islamophobia because what they fear is the emancipatory hope that anti-Islamophobia brings to the world right now. And that is one of the biggest challenges that we face, that ultimately what Muslimness represents is the ability to transcend the nation, kind of narrowly conceived nationalism, narrowly conceived ethnicism, and narrowly conceived racial logics. And what the regimes from Burma, China, many in the Arabian Peninsula, in the Middle East, in Europe, all of them are facing this crisis of trying to construct a nationalist order in a post-Western world, in a world which is post-national, in a world which they cannot contain within their nationalist fantasies. That's all.
Thank you. Thank you, Salman. Thank you for this mind-opening speech. Let me check if we have questions. We have a question. One of our viewers, he or she wrote, "I'm a French Muslim and I can't help feeling guilty with the way we keep hearing about Islam from the media. Is keeping my head low because of guilt and shame a viable long-term solution?" I think this also touches upon an important issue here. I think that's the strategy of some of the persons, but also Muslim institutions and NGOs, especially in the West, but also in the Muslim world, as you mentioned, the Islamophobia in the Muslim world, to keep it low, you know, that this will all pass, you know, with the time. Maybe I can start with Yasser. Do you think, Yasser, this is the solution? You have to, yeah.
It is not a solution on the short term, the long run, and medium, run. That's exactly what they want. And I tend to be very critical, because if they think they can impose that upon Muslims, that the signals have been given to them that they could do it, and do it without any political risk. So, of course, the media do what they do, being a corporation of individuals who are at 95% owned by 7 billionaires, who are, of course, heavily subsidized by the French state. They will not promote a vision of society as it is, which is where Muslims are everyday citizens, pay their taxes, etc., and are just part of the landscape. Now, one has to ask, how long are Muslims willing to accept this? And I think there is a deeply rooted problem in the way Muslims identify in the West, more so in France, where there has been a problem to accept all components of their own identity. And on top of it, the fact that it was perceived to be a safe course of action to, don't make any waves, try to make it, while at the same time proclaiming the high values of the teachings of Islam, of liberation, equality, etc. So I don't think it should cross anyone's mind to think that for any given amount of time, this could be viable. Now, others would ask, then what's the solution? Well, France is a country that is rigged, or filled with conflicts between the centralized Jacobin Republic and minorities. Muslims are experiencing today what others have experienced before them, and all communities are organized in France. They promote their own agendas, their own interests. They, confront the government to have their rights upheld. As a matter of fact, if you take a look at the Armenian lobby in France, they managed to pass a resolution acknowledging the region of Azerbaijan that was just, taken back by that country, the Karabakh region. In the midst of everything that's happening, they found the time to have this resolution passed. Now, of course, there is also an honest criticism to be made on the way, I can only speak for Muslims in France, and I'm not gonna, you know, venture in the US, even though I lived there and I go there every year. But in France, there is this deeply rooted colonial legacy that the relationship that clerical leaders or religious leaders and community leaders, they always tend to want to be on the right side of power, that they always want to be on the good side of the state and not make any waves. And that was explainable back then because they could be expelled, they would lose their residency. And today we see that the French government wants those people to rule Muslims because they would ask them to do that, just, you know, lower your head and accept that you are a second-class citizens without rights. And something I forgot to mention earlier, the charter for, you know, I won't even mention it as they have, but the charter that was, you know, proposed by the National Council of Imams, they prohibit the use of state racism and state Islamophobia. That's how far they're willing to go. So, and again, if that's possible, it's because Muslims have not organized enough, and they have sabotaged their own organizing to confront the state. And because it was possible for the French state to dissolve the CCIF and Bayraklı city, the message being sent is that, yes, we can make political decisions and turn them into legal actions against perfectly legal organizations. So no, the only way forward is to struggle like anyone, like any other community has, and nothing will be given to French people, whether they are Muslims or Jews or Armenians or whatever, without a struggle. And that applies to Muslims and non-Muslims.
Thank you, Yasser. I would like to ask the same question to Hatem as well, but also another question, that we see that monster has been created, you know, the Islam and Muslims, and the masses in the West especially are being entertained with this monster. But something else is happening behind the scenes. And we are seeing already in the streets of France the police brutality and the laws that are being passed in the French parliament. What do you think is happening? I mean, we've seen also in the United States the ramifications of this transformation in the West as well. I mean, the things that we thought was impossible, let's say 20 years ago in Europe or in the United States, has become normal. And the Salman already touched this on this issue, that that the Muslims, I mean, that the Islamophobia is creating a world which is not safe for anybody. And do you also think and share this opinion, and also this other question of about keeping law, you know, is a solution?
Well, on a quick answer of keeping law, how low can you go? That's the question. That has never been a safe, what you call, path, because power and oppression tends to actually always increase the capacity to inflict pain on the subject that is wanting to, what you call, not resist or not actually stand for their rights. So I don't think that as a prescription for the Muslims, be it in the global north or in Muslim majority states or in other places, I don't think that's an option. How you get out of it, again, collective effort, unity, program of empowerment has to be put in there. And I'm definitely very aware that Muslims are heavily fragmented, and the state and the power apparatus use this fragmentation to push their own policies and push their own priorities. So that's not surprising. Again, you could look at it from the colonial period all the way to the post-colonial period. As to the current period, that are we experiencing an escalation? I don't really know, just honestly speaking. If I'm looking back at the colonial era, you know, if you're looking at the world in 1914, just before World War I, 85% of the world's surface was a colony. We could speak of possibly 12 to 15 million African perishing as a result of the war in the Congo, not the war, but the genocide of the Belgium. You could speak of the death and destruction visited in North Africa and death and destruction in India, the opium wars of Great Britain in China, and then you could speak about the Monroe Doctrine in Latin America. Simultaneously, domestically in the United States, at least specifically, you had Jim Crow laws, lynchings taking place. So while I situate that we definitely are experiencing certain periods of using violent structures specifically toward the Muslims in the past 20 to 30 years, what I would say is that it is the colonial enterprise reasserting itself, and I would look at the current period in the Arab world as recolonizing the region and bringing back structures of violence that have been there or during the colonial era. And now we're becoming a little bit more aware because of modes of communication, availability of technology and so on, that otherwise we would not have been aware of. So in this sense, I do look at the uniqueness of the period, but without making it the singular unique phenomena relative to oppression, colonial discourse, Western intervention, Eurocentricity, and how these systems are being implemented. Likewise, the notion that Muslim majority states just recently all of a sudden cooperated or are becoming part of both Islamophobic today or relations with colonial powers. I would remind people that many of the political elites in parts of the Muslim world that came under colonization, they struck their deals with colonial powers in order to benefit their narrow interests at the expense of their populations and their societies, while simultaneously those who resisted often ended up being sold to the highest bidder in the process. So I do think what we need is to be very clear and cognizant both of our history and the dynamics that we are dealing with, so we don't end up, in essence, not having a very accurate and clear understanding of the phenomena that we're experiencing, and also learn lessons from the earlier period as well. So that's how at least I try to answer this question.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And we have a question directed to Salman, that you mentioned about anti-Islamophobia, and this is something new. Could you explain how such action is possible, or what the features of such an anti-Islamophobia action would be?
I think the features of anti-Islamophobia action are simply to eliminate Islamophobia. And I think one of the arguments has always been that Islamophobia is caused by what Muslims do. What I'm suggesting to you, Islamophobia is caused not by what Muslims do, but what Islamophobes think Muslims are. And that's why, to go to the previous question, the idea that staying low will somehow, or not doing anything to offend anyone, will protect you is wrong. Similarly, I think that we have reached a stage now that Islamophobia is not simply resolvable by just having meetings and sort of just talking about how Islam is wonderful, how if you it's a religion of peace, all of these things that those have gone. What you need is a commitment to anti-Islamophobia, to recognize that Islamophobia is a form of racism, and it is an attempt to target expressions of Muslimness. And what we have to argue for, or what you have to depend, is the dismantling of the Islamophobic structures. That's what Islamophobia is. Anti-Islamophobia is the removal and the ending of Islamophobia. Once you recognize that Islamophobia is now globally instituted, then anti-Islamophobia is the deinstitutionalization of Islamophobia. Too many times, too often, people have thought about Islamophobia as something which is done by thugs on the street. It's been done by people who hate Muslims, who hate religion. What they have missed, the most dangerous element of Islamophobia, is its institutionalization. It is the institutionalization of Islamophobia that permits and allows violence at the level of the street, which allows corporations and employers to discriminate against Muslims, which basically prevents Muslims from being citizens in any public space, in Muslim countries or non-Muslim countries. It is that which is really at the heart of it, and that is why what we need is a recognition of Islamophobia as being global, as being unified, in the sense of being coordinated and orchestrated, if not even orchestrated. It certainly has convergences, overlapping convergences. And anti-Islamophobia is a recognition of those convergences. It's a recognition that there is no more Islamophobia in one country. Islamophobia is global, and it has to be tackled globally.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We don't have any other question, and I think we have already had 1 hour and quarter, 15 minutes panel here, and I think that's we can finish here. I would like to thank all of you, Yasser from Paris, Dr. Hatem Bazian from California, and Professor Salman Sayyid from University of Leeds. Thank you very much for your participation and for this fruitful discussion. And I would like to thank also all our viewers for this for tonight. And thank you, and hope to see you again in another panel. Thank you.
And on a better occasion, celebrating the end of Islamophobia rather than anything else.